In this episode of Rehab Gaming Gear Review, we're going to take a look at this 8-port video audio switch that we got. It's going to be one of the cheaper versions you can locate on Amazon. It goes by multiple different brand names. Basically what they do is they produce these units in China. Multiple different companies buy the product and they put their own brand name on it. So stay tuned and we'll get right at it. So the only branding that I can find on this box is right here on the barcode sticker. It looks like Panlong is the one that is distributing this specific 8-port switch. And yes, this is manufactured in China. So the reason why I got this switch is because I needed a cheap solution in order to connect a bunch of leads for different game consoles that I'm going to be working on for testing purposes at my workbench. So I didn't want to spend a whole lot of money. It's not that important on video quality and audio quality. The biggest thing is I wanted to make sure that all the consoles that I fix are working perfectly, and this switch was going to be a great solution for that. So first things first, we're going to go ahead and open up the box, see what the box contains, and check out this 8-port video audio switch. So as soon as we open the box, we see the switch inside, and we'll go ahead and lift it right out of here. And it looks like there's nothing else in the box, so we'll go ahead and set it off to the side. So this is our 8-port switch, and we'll go ahead and remove the switch out of the bag, and it looks like there's a little info sheet in here. So on the info sheet, it's made for the multiple different types of switches they offer. It looks like a 2-port and a 4-port in addition to this 8-port that we have. And it's one-sided. Just talks about the features, stating using high-quality components and advanced circuit technology design. Isolation, the outer signal is not distorted. It doesn't interfere with one another for the inputs. And it looks like it gives some resistance values and some output level resistance, what's supported, the different hertz that's supported, and how many different input connectors there are. It really doesn't give a whole heck of a lot of information on here besides the resistance and the circuit itself. And where that comes into play is where the audio and video quality going into the switch and coming out of the switch, the resistance value will basically tell you how much the internal circuitry is going to distort or weaken the signal. So we'll go ahead and show the back of the switch. You can see all of your inputs are going to be over here on the left hand side. You have one output that's going to be over here on the right hand side. And at the front, you just have your basic switch layout. The switches are spring loaded, so as soon as you push down on one and then you go to switch to a different one, it releases that button that you originally pressed, and then this button over here for the input 2 is pushed in, and that connects the circuit for input 2. Now, the only real way to know the quality of a component is to take it apart and look at how it was designed and look at the circuitry inside. So in order to get this unit apart, it looks like it has 2 screws, 2 on either side, so a total of 4 that's holding it together. So we're going to go ahead and remove these screws and take off this top. Alright, so we got all 4 screws out of the side, and they're actually going to be extremely tiny. They are a machined self-tapping screw. Doesn't have a lot of thread on it. It's going to be a coarse thread screw, and I noticed that on one of these screws while I was taking it out, it only felt like it had grabbed on just a tiny bit and that the rest of it was kind of stripped out. So it looks like quality control on this item isn't that great, but for our purposes it's really not going to be that big of an issue. So let's go ahead and lift off this top cover. So with these, you pull the top cover back away from the faceplate and then it just lifts right off, and we'll take a look at the circuitry inside. So it looks like for the switches, they're using a soldered in design, and it doesn't look too horrible. All the connections are directly soldered to the board for all of the ports. and it looks like it has 2 ribbon cables in order to transfer the signal from the port through the system and then out over here to the output lines. Alright, so to get this front board off with the switches, there are 2 screws right here that need to be removed. I went ahead and loosened them up with my screwdriver, and they fit in there kind of tight. They were torqued down quite a bit, so it does take a little bit of pressure in order to get those screws loosened up, and then you pull back and this whole entire assembly comes out. So we'll go ahead and dump out the screws. So now we're going to look at the bottom side of the board. Looks like everything is soldered into place. There is a support bracket here for all of the switches, so the stress from pushing them in is not going to be transferred to those solder joints, which is kind of nice. And looks like those are actually crimped onto the switches themselves. It's not a part that's screwed into the case, which is kind of a shame. If this was a part that was screwed down into the case and it's a little easier to service, that would be nice in case one of these switches went bad. So we'll take a look at the bottom side. These are the holes right here that the 2 screws went through, and it looks like that this board is not grounded to the chassis, so that might cause some issue with interference. And then it looks like there's a little bit of solder spill right up here on this corner. But other than that, it doesn't look too horribly bad. There is a little bit of moisture discoloration, like when it was stored in the warehouse, it wasn't climate controlled. Now we're going to take a look at this back board here where all of the ports for your AV connections are, and we'll just go ahead and slide this back in for now. Now there are a couple of screws, quite a few screws here on the back hand side to hold all of these ports in, and it looks like that is the only mounting for this rear board that I can locate in the case. So we'll go ahead and take out 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 screws here on the back hand side, pull the board out, and take a look at those solder joints. So after a little bit of work, I was able to remove the screws on the back hand side of the casing. And if you take a look at these screws, they're a little longer than the board screws for the front switchboard, and they also look like they are self-tapping screws. And it appears that these screws actually go into the center of the AV port jacks, which is plastic. So there is a possibility for these holes to be stripped out if you tighten them too tight. So be mindful of that if you ever have to work on this, that you are going to be dealing with plastic internals that holds everything together. So we can go ahead and remove both boards together, set this casing off to the side, take a look at our solder joints and how the boards are designed. There is no circuit components other than the jacks and the switches and these ribbon cables that transfer the signal from one board to another. So that means that this is just going to be a switch that passes the signal through from one input to the output, and that it's switched in between whatever circuit that you have hooked up, but via these push button switches here. Now it is possible to not have any of the channels selected by pushing one of the switches in halfway, and it releases the other one. And just be mindful that if you don't have input signal, just make sure that the switch is fully pressed in and locked into place on whatever input you're trying to use. So again, there is some sign of moisture here. I mean, this could also be flux that's used in the soldering process. I actually highly doubt it. It looks like some sort of dirt and debris that's gotten on the board. And now that we have a close-up view of both of these boards, you can see that on these switches, only 3 pairs out of the 4 pairs of the switch are being utilized. Looks like these bottom 2 are probably going to be for the audio channels, and this top one's going to be for the video channel. And there is no pads that's actually connected to these other 2, which is a good thing because it appears that these trace paths actually go to that area. So if you do have any issues with the switch not working properly, it might be because of these pins grounding out in the circuit. I don't believe you should have to worry about it. There shouldn't be anything that you would need to change on this switch, hopefully, but that is a possibility. And also, as I'm looking at the solder joints over here, it looks like, I'll scoot this over a little bit so you can see it, but it looks like this solder joint barely has any solder on it whatsoever, and it looks like that goes to the audio channel for the output. So this is why it's always a good idea to kind of open these devices and double check them. And the more that I look at some of these solder joints, the more you can tell some of them have a decent amount of solder on there and some of them are really skimping solder. Like this whole back row over here, this joint is not soldered in very well. And then a couple of these joints over here. So before I even try and use this, I'm going to go ahead and flow some more solder into those joints just to make sure I get a really good connection. If you ever have a problem with one of these video switches where one of the channels aren't working, or where one of the connections in that channel is not working properly, it could just be because of bad solder joints on the connectors here. Alright, so I have my soldering iron heated up. I have the tip of the iron tinned and ready to go. So before you do any soldering, what I like to do is to make sure that I tin the tip, clean the tip off, and start with a fresh bit of solder on the tip. So we'll add a little bit of solder to the soldering tip. And normally on circuits I would use some type of flux, but in this case I'm not going to worry about using flux just because this is a device that's really cheaply made and it's really not needed. So we're going to reflow the solder that's currently on the pin, add a little bit more, and then back away. Now what you're wanting to see is the solder completely surround the pin to where all of the solder is touching the pin and touching the pad below. So we'll just go ahead and reflow the solder, and in between solder joints I like to clean off the excess solder from the tip. That way you get this nice shiny coating on here and it removes any oxidation from getting into the joint. Now we have all of those solder joints reflowed. So I'm going to lift the board up and kind of show you that the oxidation on the outside of these pins right here is caused by not using flux when we did the reflow. The solder that I use actually has a rosin core, so it helps with your joints. However, also the quality of the solder that they used in the manufacturing process can cause that as well. Some of these joints are a little shiny and some of them are quite dull, but as you can tell when we lift the port up, you see a little bit better solder application on these pins. So especially with these ports back here, they get a lot of stress from being having the cables plugged into them and taken out of them, and over time it can fracture these solder joints here. Now the mounting right here to the case is supposed to help alleviate that issue, but just to be safe, to make sure I had a good connection and that a solder joint wasn't broken during shipping, I went ahead and reflowed everything. Now as you could see on this back one, it actually had a large amount of solder on it. That was, instead of it being cone shaped, it was like a circular dome shape. That's what joints look like when you put a little too much solder on the joint. And in order to get that solder off, just use the tip of your iron, clean it off, and bring it towards that joint. Get some of the solder back on the tip of your iron, clean it off again, and that's how you can remove solder from joints that have a little too much solder on them. we got this audio video switch all put back together, and what I did notice is that these screws on the outside are a little touchy. It seems like they had the torque setting on their drivers at the factory a little too high, so some of these holes are slightly stripped out. So when you put these screws back in, don't tighten them down too hard, otherwise you will strip out these screws. So it's a good thing that we went ahead and cracked open this audio switch here, because those solder joints on the inside, those solder joints were not gonna do a whole heck of a lot with transferring the signal reliably from port to output. And so anything that you get from China, just be wary of, because a lot of the stuff comes from the exact same factory. It just gets rebranded with a different company name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to test out this audio video switch after we've done all that soldering. Hopefully it will work reliably, and I'll give it about 6 months or so, and we'll see what kind of temperaments that this switch has, or if it has any problems that you should be on the lookout if you plan on getting just a cheap audio video switch from Amazon or eBay. So once we test it out thoroughly, we'll let you know what we find out. So I've been using this Panlong 8-port video switch for a couple of months now, and since I reflowed all of the solder joints, I'm not having any issues whatsoever with that item. It functions perfectly. The switches reset every single time that I change to a different channel. Also, I'm not noticing any issues whatsoever with signal degradation or any noise in the signal when I'm testing consoles, but that could also be due to the fact that I'm using a powered composite to VGA converter. Overall, I'm going to go ahead and give this 8-port video switch a 2.5 out of 5 rating, and mainly that is because, one, it is not a powered unit, it's basically just a glorified pass-through device with switches. 2, the workmanship and the shoddy solder joints on the inside of this particular item that we got was just way beyond what I expected out of even a low quality switch. So unfortunately, because it does require you to actually look at the insides to make sure that everything was assembled properly, and 2, that everything is securely soldered to the board and you're not going to run into any issues with broken solder joints or possibly a connection that is not being made because it's not even soldered whatsoever. That's the reason why it's going to get a 2.5 out of 5 rating. Now, if you are fairly confident with electronics and you know how to solder and you're comfortable with your soldering skills, by all means, if you want a cheap solution, go ahead and get this, especially if you're just going to use it for testing purposes. However, if you're going to use it for a gaming setup, I would try and avoid something like this just because of those issues that we talked about. So, if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button down below. If you're new to our channel, please feel free to subscribe. So without further ado, thank you for stopping by, and we hope you have a wonderful day.